Hey everyone, so welcome to today's class in Intro to Political Science. So today's going to be the first of our lectures on political ideology. So today we're going to be looking at some of the different ideologies that exist, some that kind of organize beliefs about politics. And then in the next class, we'll start looking at some of the psychological sources of some of these different political orientations. So why psychologically do we hold them? Then in some of the future lectures, we'll continue looking at some of the kind of external sources of our political beliefs. Today's class comes from chapter 3 in the course readings. And the goals for today: explain the meaning and significance of political ideologies, define the terms left and right. So you may have heard of left wing or left or right wing, or this person is right wing in their views. So what does that mean in terms of the left-right continuum? We'll also look a little bit deeper into that in the next class. Examine the ideology of liberalism, of conservatism, and then socialism, communism, fascism, and Nazism. So kind of in terms of that organization. So start, what is political ideology? So political ideology is a package of interrelated ideas and beliefs about government, society, the economy, and human nature that inspires and affects political decisions or in political action. So it's belief about how all of these different, so a set of different beliefs, so interrelated beliefs, and it's usually about how all of these different things should operate and how they do operate. So most political ideologies provide a vision of what the world should be like and propose a means of political action to achieve their objectives. So how should society be organized? And how is it organized? What do people deserve within society? What should they be getting? Who should be belonging? What is owed to them within society, by government, in society, and by the economy? How should these things be functioning? And how are they functioning? So there's kind of an understanding of how the world works and how ideally, what would be the ideal way for it to work. Now, this isn't just one attitude on one particular issue. When we're talking about ideology, like it says, it's an interrelated package of ideas and beliefs. So it tends to be a series of beliefs that, for example, on the importance of freedom or the importance of equality, that transcends multiple issues, right? So it would be your belief about liberty in general, and it'll then influence multiple different attitudes that you'll have on government policy, on ideal arrangement of society, and on how the economy should be functioning. So we're not looking at one political attitude, we're looking at kind of the macro organizer of someone's political beliefs. And from this macro organization, then we get our individual attitudes that come from them, that are inspired from this organization, into then our attitudes on particular issues or particular questions. So someone with a shared ideology will typically have overlapping attitudes. So if someone, for example, is liberal, they'll probably have many of the same attitudes on particular issues as someone who's liberal, and someone who's conservative will typically have similar attitudes on a particular issue with other conservatives. So is ideology good or bad? It's neither, and it's both in many ways. So let's start going a little bit against the slide. Let's start with the positive aspects. So it provides some coherent consistency and direction to a person's political thinking and action. So politics is complicated, and we live complicated lives. So understanding all of politics can be very, very difficult. We've got a lot of things going in our lives, so we don't necessarily have time or energy or care to spend a lot of time understanding the nuances of politics. And so we need some way of simplification. We need some way of just organizing things into kind of a common, consistent package of views. that we can pull from. If a new issue arises, well, we could see how does it fit with this already existing ideology that we subscribe to, and that can help direct us then in terms of what should our attitude be on this particular issue. So it does allow people to have coherent views, consistent views across a number of different issues, even though they're not experts on these issues. And that is useful. It provides us with different ideas about the common good and how it can be achieved, right? So it allows for competition within society between different viewpoints. So if everybody always agreed on how society should be operating, yes, there wouldn't be much conflict, but given that no idea will ever be perfect, contestation can be good in terms of improving society. And so having ideologies and having different ideologies does allow for this contestation, having different viewpoints on the common good, and hopefully advancing over time how society operates, how well government serves the people. Negative sides. So sometimes it can be treated dogmatically. We see this increasingly, particularly if you look at the US, but also in Canada. We see it at different times that people become very, very, very attached to their own ideology. They treat people who do not share their ideology very negatively. In the States, you almost have a language of enemy, somebody who doesn't share your ideology or is part of a different political party, rather than being, a fellow American who has a different viewpoint. They're treated as un-American, or they're treated as an enemy. That's problematic, right? If you become overly attached to your ideals, to your ideology, this could be negative. The healthy viewpoint is that this is a useful organizing tool, but it's not perfect. No ideology is ever perfect. And if we hold too faithfully to ours, then we're missing out in many ways. It can be overly simplistic sometimes, so it is a useful simplifying tool, but simplifying tools also do lose nuance, right? As soon as you simplify, you lose the nuance of the situation. And this can be problematic as well. Kind of putting those two together, if you're overly dogmatic and taking too simplistic of a view, you could be kind of treating every situation as something of a particular type. So there's the expression that, if you're hammer, you view everything as a nail, right? So if you're liberal, you view everything in this particular vein, and you miss out on many of the different dynamics, many of the different aspects of the situation. Sometimes it can be used to justify the unjustifiable, right? So in the name of your ideology, people have done some very bad things, some unjustifiable things, under kind of the guise that the means justify the ends. But sometimes, as admirable as the ends may be to many people, and maybe even to you when you're looking at it, when we look at some of the means that have been used in politics before, politicians and societies have done many, many terrible things in pursuit of the common good. And some of this gets tied into their attachment to their ideology. So ideology, and we're going to unpack this a little bit more next time, is often viewed in terms of a spectrum, and often a single dimension, single continuum, with kind of a left and right end. So some people are identified as left wing, or on the left side of the continuum, and others are on the right wing or the right side of the continuum. So left or right are sometimes used as synonymous for particular ideologies. So we might say the far right or the extreme left, something like that. They come from the seating arrangement of the French National Assembly after the French Revolution in 1789. So supporters of the old order to the right, and supporters of the absolute authority of the monarch to the left. So it was based on the seating that certain people got associated with. Those on one side were on one side of the room, and those on the other side were on the other side of the room. And so that's where it originated, that we have kind of a left wing and a right wing. In contemporary usage, the left is associated with the pursuit of greater social and economic equality, while those on the right generally see inequality as a natural feature of human society. Part of what we're going to see next time when we unpack the ideological spectrum a little bit more. That's a fairly good summary of the left, that in terms of favoring equality. In terms of the right, it's not necessarily favoring inequality as favoring liberty, per se. Now, if you favor liberty and freedom, that does mean that you do accept that, you know, if everyone's free to pursue whatever they want, it's free competition, there's going to be winners and losers. And so in that sense, it's fair to say that those on the right typically view inequality as a natural feature of human society, but it's not something that, it's less motivated by they don't care about inequality, as it's they care about freedom. So there is a slight distinction there. So now we're going to look at some of the different kind of macro ideologies that exist. Now, in terms of the names of them, particularly that we've got a liberalism and conservatism, you need to be a little bit careful in terms of the names of ideologies, and political parties can be confusing at times. So for example, when it comes to liberalism, some of the views that we're going to see in some of the kind of the waves of liberalism, or the variants of liberalism we'll see, will fit quite well or fairly well with the Liberal Party. But some of them actually won't at all. And that's fairly common in multiple different parties. Some of actually what we'll define as liberalism would actually fit quite well with the Conservative Party. Conservatism will have a better overlap with the Conservative Party in Canada, but even what is conservatism can often change across times. We'll unpack that a little bit more when we get to the micro foundations, kind of the psychological foundations of conservatism. But conservatism and what you actually value can actually change at different time periods. So starting with liberalism. So liberalism is an old ideology that's developed across centuries. It emphasizes the desirability of individual freedom based on a belief in the inherent dignity and worth of each individual. So everybody is important, but rather than viewing, because everyone's important, that everyone should be treated equal, it typically more means that everyone should have equality of opportunity. Everyone should be free to pursue their own desires. So it more comes down to liberalism, liberty. Liberalism developed out of struggles against the arbitrary power of the absolute rulers, restrictions on business activities, and the lack of religious and political freedom. And under monarchies or other absolute rulers, people weren't free to make choices on on how they're going to live their lives. They weren't free to pursue the business activities that they wanted, and they had very little political or religious freedom. They had to follow, say, what the state religion was, and whatever political freedoms were granted to them by the absolute ruler, but they had no say in terms of what those political freedoms could be. So it developed kind of as a countering to those trends, and saying people should be free to make their choices in terms of how they want to live their lives, what religion they want to follow, how they're going to speak, what economic activities they're going to follow. People should be able to free to pursue those, the ones that they want. Although liberals see a need for government, they're concerned with the potential for those in governing position to abuse their power. So many of them will actually prefer limited size governments, and certainly checks and balances or a rule of law to make sure that no one could arbitrarily exercise power against you. So there is a distrust in large parts of liberalism to unchecked power because of its inspiration from times of absolute rulers. Now, some of this, where I said like this isn't going to conform very well with, say, some of the political parties in Canada, right? Some of this, in terms of the pursuit of liberty, of open economic competition, in terms of distrust of government, so small type government, actually sounds a lot more with views that we would associate with some conservatives in in uh, in Canada. In the U.S., but also in Canada, but in the U.S., you hear talk about kind of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. Some of this actually sounds more like many of the libertarian type viewpoints: distrust of government, people should have the maximum amount of freedom possible. So what are the different variants of liberalism that we see? So classical liberalism views government as having a limited purpose of protecting life, liberty, and property. So government should be as small as possible, and its sole function is to protect life. So for example, police force and judiciary and army. Liberty, so and property. So just essentially making sure that the free market is able to function properly, that and the free market to be able to function properly, and for people to have individual political freedom to make decisions on how they want to live their life. For these things to be possible, you need a government that can protect your life, your liberty, and your property. Beyond that, the government shouldn't be inserting itself into your life. It should be letting you make all the choices on how you want to live. Reform or social liberalism combines support for individual freedom with a belief that government action may be needed to help remove obstacles to individual development. This form of liberalism, and we'll return to it with some forms of kind of socialism that we'll talk about later, is more common today, particularly when we think about, say, the Liberal Party or some of the more moderate conservatives, right? You get very few, there would be some in terms of libertarians who would kind of follow a classical liberal or a neoliberal perspective. But most liberals nowadays would accept a little bit more check on individual freedom. So there's some room for the government to step in beyond just providing life, liberty, and property, but also to allow for individual development. So sometimes it may be that a group is oppressed and so don't have free access or equal opportunity within the system. It may sometimes be that the economy operating on its own isn't providing for her particular goods. And so the government needs to be able to step in to be able to provide those goods. It could be that the economy has corruption within it that's producing obstacles to individual development. So the government can step in those cases to, it should still be as small as possible, but it has greater need to operate and sometimes put a little bit more limitations on individual freedom. And then finally, neoliberalism, based on a strong belief in the values of competition, entrepreneurship, and individual responsibility, opposed to government intervention in the economy. In this view, competition is important, entrepreneurship is important. So people who work hard and take responsibility for themselves, have good ideas and work hard to develop those good ideas will be successful. And they should be allowed to succeed unfettered by government intervention. So this is allowing for a lot more inequality in this particular case. Conservatism. Conservatism, particularly in its traditional form, emphasizes the value of order and stability in the community, traditionally less concerned with individual rights. So individual rights could still be important to conservatives, but even more important to conservatives typically is maintaining a traditional society. So society has been organized in a particular way. It has particular values, whatever those values may be at that given time. And conservatives are typically resistant to changes to tradition. So they're attached to tradition and they prefer stability and order within that tradition. So they don't want changes. Conservatism views humans as imperfect and possessing a limited capacity for reason, argues that society should respect the wisdom of the past. That's probably more a little bit on the philosophical grounds to conservatism, probably not something that many conservatives have thought through too much. But there certainly is the element of society should respect the wisdom of the past, but it's not necessarily about the wisdom of the past. It's more about an attachment just to how things are done. The conservatives are satisfied with the way things are done. They're happy with things are done. They value the way things are done, and they oppose anything that would be changing how society functions. Conservatives typically favor strong government and leadership that protects order and stability. So when we're talking about strong government, we don't necessarily mean big government here that's doing a lot of things, but one that has strong capacity. So you'll often see, so for example, many conservatives will be in favor of strong police forces and strong criminal systems, right? To make sure that any challenges to the status quo, the state is able to deal with it and punish it. So many conservatives will be very big in terms of law and order. Many conservatives favor the maintenance of traditional religion-based moral values to prevent the collapse of civil society. So part of the tradition that conservatives are attached to is in terms of not just traditions of how things are done, like political structures, but also about the values that exist in society. So what do we value? What is right and what is wrong within society? Often this sense of morality, these values are defined by whatever the dominant religion is in the society. So for example, in North America, typically rooted in a Judeo-Christian, particularly a Christian value structure, and are very attached to and very resistant to any change in those values. So morality and liberalism typically doesn't really come in and play any role within conservatism. So for example, in liberalism, people should be free to pursue whatever religion they want and pursue whatever values they want. People should have freedom of choice. In conservatism, there's a preferred social order. There's a preferred morality in society, a preferred set of values, and government should be there in terms of supporting that value structure. All of these different ideologies are often changing. So for example, we saw with liberalism, there's been different values that or variants that have existed. There's also been changes in terms of conservatism. So what we refer to as the new right and social conservatism. It's a contemporary version of conservatism termed the new right, developed in the 1970s, combining free market economics, limited government, and traditional cultural and moral values, right? So in terms of when we're looking at the ideologies that we had before. We seem to be bringing in terms of the new right, we seem to be bringing in elements that were with kind of classical liberalism combined with elements of kind of traditional conservatism, right? So limited government, free market economics, we would normally associate with liberalism, classical liberalism, neoliberalism. Traditional cultural and moral values, we would traditionally associate with conservatism. So it's kind of a bringing of these together. So if we look at the Conservative Party today, not all conservatives, but we look at the Conservative Party today, you have different versions of conservative. You have the social conservatives who are in favor of free market economics, limited government, but also are very attached to maintaining traditional cultural and moral values. So being Canadian has certain values associated with it, and anything that challenges these values is something the government should oppose. The Conservative Party also has what we would identify as kind of your more libertarian or your neoliberal faction, who don't really have any stance on traditional cultural and moral values, but they want a small government that allows for economic competition between people and respects the individual rights. And then you have some conservatives who really are just about traditional cultural and moral values without much of a viewpoint on free market economics and limited government. It's all about kind of law and order, strong government to protect traditional cultural and moral values. You have each of those within the same party, which can sometimes lead to competitions for who will dominate the Conservative Party. So for example, a Stephen Harper versus a Peter MacKay type when we had that competition for leadership between Harper and MacKay, right? Each of them had different viewpoints or different associated with different kind of variants of conservatism. And so you see this playing out within the Conservative Party in terms of what policies do they support, particularly when it comes to traditional cultural and moral values. Some are very attached to kind of this Judeo-Christian conception of Canadian values. Other conservatives are more come down on the everybody should be free to pursue their religious freedom. Everybody should be free to pursue their religion. The state shouldn't be involved in setting moral values. And you have that inherent tension within the Conservative Party. Social conservatives focus primarily on moral values and advocate for policies based on traditional and religious value. The New Right differs from traditional conservatism in adherence to free market ideals, foreign policies aimed at exporting democratic values, and populist attitudes that are sometimes critical of government. So the populist part we see a little bit, for example, in Donald Trump, but even before Trump, in terms of kind of the free market ideals, more of a limited type government. So bringing in some of the things that we traditionally viewed as liberalism, but also putting some of the things that we viewed as conservatism when it came to social values on steroids. Socialism is one of the most complex ones that we'll look at in terms of people typically have a strong opinion when it comes to socialism. So, for example, particularly in the U.S., socialism is used by some on the right in particular to dismiss an idea. Oh, this is socialist, and that could be like the death blow to a policy. And part of that's in terms of confusion about the breadth of socialism. So its most extreme, what we'll look at, you've got kind of communism, although many of the communist governments we saw had very little socialism in them per se, or certainly weren't the way socialism was envisioned, all the way over to what we'll look at in terms of social democracies, and to certain extents, all Western democratic countries are in some form social democratic. They vary in the extent that they're social democratic, with the US probably, the US and UK scoring kind of as the least social democratic, and maybe your Scandinavian countries as the most social democratic, but all of them have some form of social democracy, including the US in there. So if you look at, if you categorize based on the policies that we actually see in any given country, many of the things that would be supported by social democracy or supported within socialism are already facts of life within all these Western democracies, and are things that even the most ardent of conservatives in society would accept as just necessary within the state. So socialism developed as an important political ideology in reaction to the harshness of early capitalist system. Early capitalist system, even compared to today, where we see a lot of inequality, was very harsh on workers. So kind of the free functioning of the economy led to a lot of exploitation of workers, minimum wages, very bad working conditions, all in search of profit for the business owners. Socialists viewed human beings as basically social in nature, and that capitalism undermines the cooperative and community-oriented nature of humanity. So free, unfettered competition isn't in socialism what human society is supposed to be about. It's overly individualistic, where people in reality, they say, care about their community, care about helping other people, don't want to leave people behind, and society owes it to people not to be leaving others behind. Within the socialist ideology, there's a variety of views as to what an ideal society would be like and how society could be achieved. So we'll look at some of those now. So kind of on one extreme, we've got your Marxism and communism type views. So Karl Marx and Engels produced a critique of the capitalist system of production based on what they refer to as historical materialism. And essentially they made the argument that there's incompatible interests between the working class and the bourgeoisie. So those who own businesses and those who work in the businesses, between those who own capital, so who own factories, own machines, own companies, and then those who work in them. And that this will eventually result in a revolutionary force that overturns capitalism. In terms of their historical materialism, they look at this process where over time, fewer and greater amounts of the resources in society are owned by a smaller and smaller amount of capital owners. So it would have started with a lot of capital owners and still even larger amounts of workers, but over time through capitalism and competition, as different businesses get swallowed up through competition, we see the resources get more and more concentrated in the hands of a smaller amount of people, and by necessity, if more and more of the resources are shared by a smaller amount of people, that means the vast majority of people are fighting over smaller and smaller scraps of the remaining resources. So there's less and less and less for the majority of people. And at a certain point, at a certain tipping point, Marx and Engels argued that eventually those in the majority, those in the working class, would have few enough resources that eventually they'd have enough of the system and they'd have a revolution overthrowing the capitalist system. After this revolution, the capitalist system based on private ownership and free competition would disappear, and it would be a new system based on collective and communal ownership. So society owns and society shares everything, and so things are shared equitably across everybody in society. In Leninism, which was a particular variant of communism, which was followed by the Soviet Union, well, at least in terms of the overthrow of the Russian government and the creation of the Soviet Union, it was argued that the capitalist society can only be overthrown with force through a disciplined party. So rather than the masses coming together and just reaching this tipping point and the masses coming together, what was required was that the argument for Lenin was that this wasn't going to work, and what you needed instead was a disciplined party, an organized party to lead the revolution against the government. So it had to have some form of organization. Now, in a weaker form of socialism, or a less extreme, slightly more centrist version, we have democratic socialism. And so in this view, democratic methods should be used to work towards a socialist society, and that socialist society should be democratic. So rather than a revolution to change from a capitalist society into a socialist society, It should, rather than being a revolution, it should be done through democracy, pursued through democracy. And the organization after kind of the revolution or the transformation into the socialist society, that government should still be run democratically. It favors measures such as public ownership of key industries, cooperative enterprises, workers' rights to unionize and to have a voice in businesses, and government planning of the economy. So if you look at modern economies nowadays, you see important elements of these already within all the different states we look at. So public ownership of key industries. So this varies across your different countries. There'll usually be some level of it. So for example, in Canada, we still have, in some key vital industries, we still have crown corporations to make sure, for example, electricity doesn't cost too much and is available to everyone. So to kind of put some caps on it. Rights to unionize are protected in almost all democracies, at least all Western democracies, and in certain democracies, Western democracies, unions are extremely strong. So Canada or Quebec would kind of be a middle road one, much stronger, say, than in the US context, and much greater support even among business owners for the idea of unionizing, but weaker than many Western European unions are even more powerful in good parts of Europe. If you travel to areas in Western Europe, you will see how frequent it is to have strikes going on. Social Democrats believe that the capitalist economy can be reformed to work for the common good. So not necessarily when we're dealing with communism or Marxism, it was the complete requirement for the overthrow of the capitalist society. Capitalism was inherently problematic. In social democracy, capitalism isn't inherently problematic if there are certain restraints put on it. So for example, the right of workers to unionize to protect and make sure that that capital owners aren't exploiting their workers. If you've got strong unions to protect the right of workers, then workers will be at least earning enough, right? So you could still have a fair functioning system where everybody's doing better. Social democratic ideas provided much of the basis for the consensus concerning the welfare state. And much of what we have, like I said, that pretty much all Western democracies have some element of socialism is in terms of the welfare state. So things like, in Canada, universal healthcare, which outside of the States is pretty much a fact of life in all democracies and many non-democracies even. And even in the States, there are some people who have social healthcare in terms of Medicare or Medicaid programs. And the US is moving slightly more towards kind of a free access to healthcare, but also things in terms of unemployment insurance, in terms of social security payments, in terms of so different government handouts that is provided to those who may otherwise fall through the crack. The problem with capitalism is that at a certain point, if tragedy strikes, if you have an injury and you can't work, or if you lose your job and it's a tight economy and you can't find it, you can end up with nothing. In a pure capitalist economy where you're dealing with kind of a more liberal viewpoint or conservative viewpoint where the government should remain small, you could just fall through the cracks and have nothing. In the welfare state, you have certain protections that you have a safety net that can help get you back onto your feet. You're not going to be living a rich life, but you're not going to be falling to somewhere where you have nothing. That's something that's accepted, even in the US, where socialism can be a dirty word to many people. Many of these different programs, things like many of these different safety net programs, are things that everybody accepts as a fact of life. But really, they're programs that were developed, they're socialist programs. Then finally, social democracy, the belief that capitalist economy can be reformed to ensure that it works for the common good. So something that we saw in the last slide, but a kind of more of a tenet of social democracy. Social democrats advocate for greater social and economic equality to achieve a meaningful democracy, right? So if we want to have a meaningful democracy, if we want to have a full functioning society, we have to be aware of social inequality and economic inequality. So liberty and freedom are important, but so too is equality. And democracy without kind of the social component, or liberalism or conservatism, can leave too many people behind. It comes down too heavily on the liberty side. Conversely, straight up, full out communism may come down too far or too weak on the liberty side, where social democracy tries to strike this balance where people are still free. It's still a capitalist economy. People can still pursue what they their own goals, but there has to be a level playing field for everyone, both in terms of people not being able to get left behind because of a social group they belong to, so race, gender, whatever it may be, and also everyone deserves a fair shot at economic incentives. So, for example, one thing that social democracy will sometimes be dealing with is the problem that we say everyone should have equality of opportunity, but those who are born into richer families typically have more of advantages in terms of getting well-paying jobs. So we can't really say that there's equality of opportunity. We can't really say, which is a basic tenet of much of liberalism, is equality of opportunity. But social democrats will come down and say that this, without some level of checks on social and economic inequality, it's not really a fair system. Creation of the welfare state, we already talked about. For social justice, global social justice, and the development of democratic global institutions. And so even in terms of kind of the international politics, there should be kind of a cooperation between different social democracies to advance a more equal world, and are critical of economic globalization. Similar to the complaints that social democrats will have about unchecked capitalism, well, globalization in much of the way it works is unchecked, or free trade in a free trade system is unchecked capitalism. So not necessarily against globalization completely, but saying that there are certain limits on it, there are certain times where it's not operating fairly, and that we need to be able to deal with it. Finally, fascism and Nazism. So fascism is an ideology that combines an aggressive form of nationalism with a strong belief in the naturalness of inequality and a strong opposition to both liberal democracy and communism. Very strong nationalism, an aggressive form of nationalism. So when we talk about nationalism, I said that nationalism is not necessarily bad if it's just about an attachment to your group. Where nationalism can become a problem is where it's not only such a very strong attachment to the group, but it's also a feeling that your group is superior to other groups. And that's where fascism will come in, with its a feeling of identity where you are superior to others. Inequality becomes a natural feature of society and is to be accepted. And then liberal democracy and communism are both the enemy. This is, in terms of communism being the enemy, this is where it's sometimes funny where you see mistakes that get made by rookie politicians who aren't experienced and don't necessarily have a strong understanding of the world. And, they'll say, we fought in World War II against the communist Nazis. And I mean, it's a comical statement, or an ignorant statement, in the sense that almost public enemy number one for any fascist government is communism. Communism is the exact opposite of, in many senses, communism in the left-right divide. Communism is the most extreme left, and fascism is the most extreme right. You can't, in terms of the political spectrum, they're about as far apart as you could possibly get. So when they get equated as the same. It's showing an ignorance to just the basics of political ideology, to how politics is structured. In the fascist view, the well-being of the individual is based on the well-being of the nation state to which the individual belongs. So rather than privileging the individual, which you typically do in more kind of liberal societies, it's everything is in service of the state. If the state does well, the people within the state will do well. So everything should be done in glory to the state. The stronger the state is, the better off everyone will be within it. Nazism was a form of fascism. So not all fascists are Nazis, all Nazis were fascists. A version of fascism that included anti-Semitism, racism, extreme nationalism, and imperialism. So extreme nationalism is ubiquitous within fascism. Racism or anti-Semitism isn't a necessary feature of fascism. It was a feature of Nazism. It's not inconsistent with fascism, but you could be fascist and not be racist. You could be a fascist and not be anti-Semitic. The imperialism portion, many fascist regimes, because of the belief wanting to have the state be as strong as possible, and because of feeling superiority towards other groups, will tend to be expansionist at minimum, so want to expand the state as much as possible, possibly to the point of setting up an empire, not necessarily. Fascism and the radical right. So although fascism is often associated with Italy and Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, fascist movements have existed in many countries and continue to exist in many countries. So World War II wasn't the end of fascism. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, you could say fascism was probably at all-time lows in many areas, but across time, its ideals have started making a return. A number of radical right movements and far right and neo-fascist political parties have developed in Europe and elsewhere in recent years. So particularly in the multi-party systems of many European ones, you certainly have sizable minority parties who border on fascist, if not are outright fascist. So you'd find these parties in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Austria, not in power, but still receiving non-trivial portions of the vote. You even have in the US, right? If you looked at some of the alt-right groups that were participating in Charlottesville, that participated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol building. Some of them were your traditional Republicans or your Trump Republicans, but some of them, if you looked at the kind of the manifestos of the group they represent or the flags they were carrying, represented neo-fascist or neo-Nazi type parties. In Charlottesville, you saw people with swastikas marching. So even in the States, and Canada would not be devoid of these groups, not in terms of as the same level of penetration necessarily into the political parties. You'd find some at the very fringes of the Conservative Party, but not the same level of penetration as there is, say, in the Republican Party in the US. So not necessarily at the same levels that you see in some parts of Europe and growing in the US, but also a concerning growth within Canadian politics as well. The contemporary parties draw on ideals of radical nationalism. So nationalism where, again, with the superiority element, anti-immigration sentiment. So to try to galvanize people towards supporting their views, painting immigrants as a threat to jobs, to the social fabric of the country, and to security. So, the ideas of, immigrants are rapists and murderers, or immigrants will steal your jobs, or immigrants don't think or believe like us, and so they're going to transform the country. And in some cases, ethnic purity. So some of it, there definitely will be a racist undertone to some of it in terms of, in the Western European and North American context, in terms of a white supremacy. White supremacist groups will fit with the fascist or radical right umbrella. And finally, kind of as a helpful study tool, you've got ideologies, key themes for liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and fascism. So how do they view human nature? What is key value? What political system is supported? What are the preferred rights or most important rights? What is their view on morality? And what economic system do they support? So in terms of helping you study as a guide, this will be useful. So next time we're going to go a little bit deeper into the psychology of ideology. Why is it that some people are liberals? Why are some people conservative? What is the psychological underpinning of some of these different stances? Is a left-right, a single left-right continuum for ideology, is that appropriate for understanding people's views? So we're going to go a little bit into that to unpack it.